And we're just starting another project looking at Nubian identity and culture, which will be starting in January next year. And again, all of that will be made available on the website. Now, when I consulted my students, they struggled to explain how you might successfully represent Kemet in a gallery. And again, I wish to stress that the material should speak for itself, but as I said, I wanted people who have not viewed Egypt in this way, or looked at it in this way before, to try and look at it again from a different perspective. In the physical gallery that you saw, we've got an information panel explaining what Kemet means, both in an ancient and a modern sense, and why it's important to look at Egypt within its African context. It also explains how the population has changed over time, and looks at quotes by the Greeks and the Romans, which again, as I said, firmly place it within Africa. It was really in the virtual version, and we're just finishing this off, where we were able to sort of brand, or I suppose I should say rebrand, Egypt as Kemet. And the way we've done this, and my students, it was their idea to actually come up with a version of our galleries that they could use whilst they're still in prison. Said very strongly that they really wanted to express their ideas through the objects and also through the information that we had there. So I've been working very closely with them on this. And we've decided that one good way of doing this is to actually sort of have this across the top with very strong African imagery and the title Kemet, the Black Land, rather than calling it Virtual Egypt, which is kind of what it started off as. We've also tried doing things like giving sort of skin colour to some of the statues. There's an image here of one of the Amana princesses, or of Nefertiti, on the left-hand side. And you can see that the person I've been working with, Richard Weston, who's working on a lot of sort of virtual galleries and how you use photography virtually. He's given this sort of skin colour to the statue, and immediately it starts to look more like a person. Now, I think a lot of white people get caught up with the idea that if something's African, it has to have dark brown or black skin, whereas somebody who's African or of African descent will start to notice features. So a lot of my students have said things like, that looks like my aunt, or that looks like my sort of grandmother from Somalia, for instance. And it's that sort of engagement at that level that I think is quite important for mainstream Egyptologists. Now, I'm extremely fortunate to have been guided by my students over the past 2 years, and also to allow for this kind of transfer of knowledge between me as a subject specialist and them as sort of people who are actually interested, actively interested in a culture that's often, as I said, decontextualised or just seems to float around. That's been very important when looking at some of the objects, and again, you can see sort of an afro comb at the top, which is 5,000 years old. People didn't think that people had afro combs that long ago. And it's quite nice for people to see something that they're maybe using on a daily basis, and to actually try and sort of contextualise that and to connect to it as well. Things like the herring on the right-hand side as well. The headdress, I've had several sort of students from Nigeria say that they remember in sort of villages when their grandmothers were alive that they saw these things, these headrests, that people were still using them. And again, it's a nice way that people can connect to an ancient culture. And we've already talked this morning about sort of oral tradition and movement of people around Africa, and it's always, I think, quite empowering for people to be able to share that information with other people in the group. So finally, what I'd like to do is just sort of finish up. I've suggested some ways in which you can try to present Kemet in a gallery or online or connected to your museum. If anybody's got any other examples, I'd be really happy to hear them. As Karen said, it's really important that people come up with ideas so we can then try and incorporate them in how we use the cultures that we are curating. What I'd like to finish up is by looking at the impact of teaching African-centred Egyptology, or Kemet, within a prison environment. And I mention it's in a prison environment because quite often, if you're actually in prison, then you go through a period of reassessment and looking at yourself again. And a lot of people have done studies on religious conversion within the prison system. I find with a lot of the black British students I work with, they'll try different religions, and then they'll actually look to their history and their heritage as a way of reassessing their place in life and where they're currently at. I've been doing lots of different types of teaching over the past sort of 6 years, really. As I said, the last 2 years full time, and I've got over 1,500 evaluations, which I need to sit down and look at very carefully. I've done a survey on Black History Month recently, what people's expectations are of that. I've done qualitative interviews looking at Nubian identity, before and after study, looking at how having information can change people's view, not only of ancient Egypt, but also of other people's identities currently in Britain, and running several focus groups as well. Now, I've noticed something quite interesting. If the lecture that I give is advertised as Black History, I'll get almost exclusively Black students attending. But if I advertise the lecture as Egypt, I'll get a very mixed audience. I've also noticed that the impact of presenting Egypt as an African culture, and more to the point, the ancient Egyptians as Black people, and non-Black community members, and this is quite important. As we've noted, people respond differently to the use of the terms African and Black, and I think that's very important to acknowledge. They're more likely to agree to the former, whereas the latter will provoke normally a negative reaction. And I'm pleased to say that in most cases it's easy to get people to change their perceptions or get them to sort of sit down and think, just by simply giving them access to the evidence. Now, many of my students who are white British have been fascinated by the concept that Egypt is African, and it's something that they hadn't thought of, because when it was taught to them at school, it was taught out of context. And one actually expressed outrage in the fact that the media and the education system has put it dupe to. There have been the occasional negative responses from white students, including one who said he felt that I was letting the side down as a white person. And occasionally my motives for presenting Egypt as an African culture have also been questioned, and that's by people asking me if I'm married to somebody who's Black or if I have mixed-race children. I mentioned wanting to avoid tokenism in relation to the museum displays, and a key part of the reason for my 2 years away from the museum were to look in detail at the impact of using museum collections and of teaching Kemet as part of Black history. And as I've said, it with particular reference to people serving current prison sentences. Now, our regional prisons cater for London overspill, so from my perspective, somebody who's based in the east of England, it gives me a much wider range of people who I can teach, interact with, and also sort of have this knowledge transfer with. Also, there's the fact that, which is well known, that Black people are overrepresented in the prison system in this country. So, whereas we have quite a small Black British community in Cambridge, and the communities, some of the prisons where I work, is 80% of the population. My research was based on what we call grounded theory, and I'd observed a high level of interest in exploring Kemet in some of the higher security estates, and a lot of people there are actually studying for degrees because they've been in prison for quite a long time. And I particularly noticed this amongst Black British and to a lesser extent people of Jamaican or West African origin. And as I've said, those are three main groups with whom I was working closely. I found, and perhaps no surprise here, that there were substantial differences for each of those groups, depending on where they'd been brought up, which school system they went through, and also with regards to their religion. I'll come back to that in a moment. Nevertheless, what these three studies that I did have demonstrated was the importance of Kemet within the study of Black history, and also the positive impact it could have on potential, in some cases actually on offending behaviour. These are 4 quotes from a survey that I did, which formed part of an MPhil dissertation, looking at the impact of teaching Black history on the self-concept of Black male prisoners. Not a very catchy title, but it explains what I was doing. And when I asked people the question, was Egypt part of African history, was it positive or was it negative? These are some of the responses. 44-year-old student who I interviewed said, it's very positive, it gives you a feeling of pride. I think that ancient Egypt is obviously a significant part of Black history. Is it positive? Well, it was positive when I was listening to you giving your talk, but I'm sure there's negative aspects because people want to write history in a certain way, and that's the negative side. And several of my students who I interviewed said that actually there was a negative side to it because of the way that people were interpreting it. Positive, but it has its negative parts because the understanding of it, my understanding until I met you, I had my own perceptions of what they looked like. Every time you see the Egyptians, you also see their faces smashed off. I had my own inkling, but I never had the evidence. And then I got clarification that they was Black people, and that's a quote, direct quote. Other people felt that it was much more part of world culture and world heritage, which of course it is. And just because it happens to be in Africa, it shouldn't exclude people who don't have that direct connection to Africa, exploring it and enjoying it as much as when it was decontextualised. And one of the students I interviewed said it's definitely positive, like I keep saying, it's part of Black history, but I always say it's part of everyone's history. It's for all brothers and sisters, for all people of the world. So I don't like to label something as this or that. I wouldn't think this is right, because the world belongs to the people. There were problems, and I mentioned religion, and lots of the people who I interviewed who were Muslim or who converted to Islam had a real issue with the sort of paganism, as they put it. Sort of 25-year-old student who I'd seen several times before I interviewed him said. So I think Egypt is the epitome of black history, and I think it is positive. The only negative thing I could say about Egyptology, that civilization, is the paganism. I know it was a long time ago, I don't agree with some of the rituals. I'm not into paganism at all, and like idol worshipping and stuff. It was BC, so they can get away with it. Now, there was quite a difference in the responses of the participants who'd explored Kemet on their own, or who'd been attending lectures that I've been giving on the subject, and those who hadn't been exposed to Egyptian history apart from what they'd seen on the TV. And those people who've been involved all believed that ancient Egypt was part of African history. They naturally assumed that that was the case. But the importance of exposure to things like books, lectures, information on African history was indicated by a 39-year-old who I hadn't met before I interviewed, but who was very open when I talked to him. And he said, I feel that Egypt is part of black history, but only because of what I've been reading recently. And he'd been sort of talking to people within the prison system who'd been looking at Egypt as part of their heritage. People noticed a discrepancy between what they'd seen in the classes and what they were seeing in terms of the objects I was showing them, and as I said, what was presented by the films and the media. And a lot of people looked at the statues and said, but you can tell that they're African even by looking at the statues. There was one additional negative connotation, however, that I really hadn't thought of. And it's possible that this is just because of the environment that I was in, and I was in the higher security estate. It was a very obvious one to this group of people, and I think because they were actually thinking about their own demonised identity as black British men, largely, and also that some of them, well, a lot of them had actually been involved with gangs. And I really hadn't thought about the link between violence in ancient Egypt and on the streets today, and that's quite shocking because I actually sort of specialise in rulers, and it just hadn't occurred to me at all. Several interviewees stated that the subject of Kemet had both positive and negatives, and a couple of them actually said they saw the Egyptian kings as tyrants, and the wars that these people had provoked, they felt that they shouldn't be glorified because they did actually make a reference to modern gang leaders in the so-called gangster culture. And they said that it was people that simply wanted to be rich at any cost, and they compared this directly to modern aspirations amongst young black men in particular. And the subject was raised by other interviewees in reference to the problems of black youth today in inner cities, and also their causes of their involvement with crime. So in many respects, my research tried to capture why Kemet is important to people and to share it with non-African communities, the personal connections that people who are African or African descent can naturally make. I hope that in doing so that the concept of Kemet will be treated a little bit more seriously and with a bit more respect, because it clearly is very, very important to this group of people. So it won't simply be the subject that's reserved for people who have a direct connection to Africa, but as I've said, that everybody can actually explore it from this point of view. They may conclude that the traditional way of presenting Egypt is preferable to them, but I still think they need to explore it. And perhaps most importantly, and summarised by one of my sort of longest students, Kemet potentially has an important role within modern society in informing a positive identity. He didn't wish to be categorised in terms of his racialised or ethnicised identity. He's a 45-year-old man. He said black history would stop young black people being aimless, a purpose in life and something to do, like they could strive for perfection. They could strive to perfect themselves and look at great rulers and these black people who they built these pyramids and used to eat with golden knives and forks, and you know what I'm saying? They had all the bling bling, but it was on a different level. Thank you.